32 years. 800 of the finest shooters this country ever produced. Not one confirmed hit. They called it impossible. Then they stopped calling it anything. They just accepted it as weather. A canyon in Nevada rock. Dust. A steel target hanging 1,400 meters away, small enough to make a man doubt his own eyes. 16 shots, 16 misses. The canyon swallowed every round without leaving a mark. 16 men stepped back from the line in silence. The last shooter stepped forward. A hand settling onto a rifle stock. Not gripping, not trembling. Just resting there the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you have known a long time. And the eyes, not going to the scope, watching the dust. The night before in the Nevada dark, someone had sat alone on the canyon rim for 2 hours. Nobody asked her to. Nobody knew she was there. She just sat and counted. What did she see that 32 years of impossible never did? Colonel Walter Britten was alone at 11 p.m., which was not unusual. He was often alone at 11 p.m. The office had a way of holding him past the point where staying made sense, past the point where there was anything left to do, past the hour when most men had already gone home, poured something strong. Let the day dissolve into whatever the evening offered. Britten didn't dissolve things. He carried them. The photograph sat in the corner of his desk. It was always in the corner of his desk. A young woman in uniform, mid-law, squinting into sunlight that had existed 21 years ago and would never exist again. She looked like him around the eyes, same jaw, same stubborn set to the mouth that their mother had called willful and their father had called Britten. Through and through, he looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned it, face down, same as every night. He turned off the desk lamp, walked to the door, closed it behind him with the particular care of a man who had learned that some rooms needed to be shut firmly, or they followed you home. Outside, the base was quiet, not silent. The quiet of a military installation after midnight was its own specific thing. Not the absence of sound, but something more deliberate. The quiet of a place resting between purposes. Between what it had been asked to do today and what it would be asked to do tomorrow. Britten walked to his quarters. He did not look at the stars. He hadn't looked at the stars in a long time. She arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong, somehow. Tuesdays were ordinary. Tuesdays were the week's least interesting sentence. Grocery runs and oil changes and conference calls that existed because someone couldn't write an email. Tuesdays were not the day you showed up to one of the most demanding military sniper qualification programs. The history of the United States Armed Forces. But Sergeant First Class Claire Reeves had never done anything on the world's schedule. She stepped off the transport at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado at 0630, one duffel bag, a rifle case she had carried since her second tour, and the kind of quiet that made people check over their shoulder. Not because she was threatening, not because she looked dangerous, though she was, and she did. Because she wasn't performing anything. Most people perform something when they arrive somewhere that matters. Confidence, readiness. Some small theater of self that tells the room what to think before the room forms its own opinion. Claire Reeves walked across that parking lot like she had already decided what this place was. Like she had sized it up before the transport stopped moving and found it roughly what she expected. 34 years old. 5'7", 142 pounds of lean muscle and scar tissue and something harder than either of those things. Eyes, and didn't have a name in any military field manual ever written. Her father would have called it readiness. Not the performance of it, the actual thing. Robert Reeves had been a lot of things in his life. Marine Scout Sniper, Staff Sergeant, 2 official tours of combat and 1 tour that never appeared in any official record. A man who could sit in a deer blind for 6 hours without shifting his weight and emerge calm and precise and absolutely certain of what he had seen. He had also been her father for 34 years. And then, 11 months ago, he had been the man in the chair by the window of his farmhouse in Montrose, Colorado, watching the mountains go gold in the last light of a September evening, his hands thin in hers, his voice mostly breath. "You already know everything I taught you," he had said. "Now you just have to trust it." She had promised him 3 things that night, written in her own handwriting in the inside cover of his Bible, left on the shelf in that farmhouse that was now empty, but not silent, foot with honor. Never quit, become the sniper. They said you couldn't be. She didn't read them every morning like a ritual. She didn't need to. They lived in her the way certain things lived in people who had carried them long enough. Not memories, architecture, the load-bearing walls of who she was. She set her tear duffel down on the grinder and stood at attention with everyone else, lush. She did not look around for allies. She simply waited. 23 other candidates were assembled on that grinder. Every single one of them elite. Rangers, recon Marines, Special Forces operators hand-selected from the top percentile of the top percentile. Men who had already survived things that ended careers and marriages and sleep. Men who had looked at hard and found it workable. And every single one of them looked at Claire Reeves the same way. Not hostile. Not exactly. More like confused. The confusion that existed in the half-second before judgment formed. Before a person decided what they were looking at and what it meant, a ranger named Garrett Stoll. Broad, precise. The kind of soldier who moved like he had already calculated the fastest exit from every room he entered, leaned toward the man beside him and said it just loud enough. Just barely loud enough. "Command really doing this?" The man beside him didn't answer. But he didn't disagree. Claire heard it. She always heard things. Her father had taught her that hearing was not about volume, it was about attention. Most people listened when sounds were loud. Claire had been trained from the age of 9 in a deer blind in the Rockies of Colorado to listen when things were quiet. Because quiet was when the information was real, she filed it away, not with anger, not yet, the way you filed a wind reading you'd need later. Colonel Walter Britten walked out of the operations building at 0645, and the grinder changed temperature, not theatrically. He didn't stride or perform or arrange himself for effect. He simply appeared, a man of 51, iron gray hair cut close to his skull, a uniform pressed by someone who took pressing seriously. He walked the way men walked when they had stopped trying to intimidate people because the intimidation traveled ahead of them now. Automatically. Without effort or intention, he stopped in front of the assembled class, looked left to right, paused on faces, moved on, and then his eyes landed on Claire. They stayed there for 3 full seconds. In the military, 3 seconds was a statement. 3 seconds of eye contact across a rank differential. That significant was not an accident. It was a message. The message was, "I see you. And I've already decided something about what I see." Claire met it directly. She had made this decision years ago, not from pride. Pride was a luxury that got people killed in her experience, but from strategy. The moment you dropped your eyes was the moment the other person discovered they had a lever. And Claire Reeves had spent her entire adult life making sure nobody found her levers. Britten looked away first. But it wasn't the look away of a man who had backed down. It was the look away of a man who had confirmed something he already suspected. Something he didn't particularly like confirming. He began his opening address. The Advanced Sniper Qualification course, he told them, had a completion rate of 41%. He said this the way a forecast mentioned rain. Factual, flat, without investment in how it landed. 41%. Which meant roughly 10 of the 24 people on this grinder would not finish. Some would quit. Some would be cut for performance. A few, and here he paused in a way that made the word few carry the weight of a small catastrophe, would sustain injuries that ended careers. This program, Britten said, does not grade on curves. It does not make accommodations. It does not care about your prior record, your commendations, or what your commanding officer wrote in the recommendation. That Got you here." He began walking the front row as he spoke. Slow. Deliberate. The only thing this program cares about is whether, when everything else is stripped away, you can do the one thing that matters. You can wait. You can think. And then you can put a bullet exactly where it needs to go. Under conditions that are actively trying to make that impossible. He stopped. He was standing directly in front of Claire. "Is that understood, Sergeant Reeves?" The way he said her name, precise, clinical. A scalpel finding the right angle. A question that was not a question. "Yes, sir." Flat. Clean. No color in it whatsoever. He held her gaze for one more beat. Something moved through his expression. Not anger. Anger would have been simpler. This was more complicated than anger. The look of a man who had already decided a situation and was now confronting something in the situation that didn't fit the decision. He turned and walked back to center. "Good. Because starting tomorrow, I'm going to show every one of you exactly what impossible actually looks like." He meant it. For the class. Every one of those 23 men, and Claire herself, knew he had said it for her. That night she cleaned her rifle. Not superstition. Not nerves. Her father had taught her that a sniper's relationship with their rifle was not like a carpenter's relationship with a hammer. A hammer was a tool. A rifle, at the distances and precision a true sniper operated, was closer to a musical instrument. You had to know it the way you knew a person. Its personality, what it did in cold, in heat, in humidity. The tiny variations in trigger pull that shifted, depending on how long you'd been holding position. She cleaned the bolt slightly. Set it carefully on the cloth. Thought about her father's hands. How they'd moved through this same ritual for 40 years, steady. Precise. The hands of a man who had learned, in places the government didn't put on official records, that the difference between coming home and not often lived in the millimeters. "You already know everything I taught you." She picked up the bolt assembly. "Now you just have to trust it." She kept cleaning. The first week was designed to find where candidates broke. No pretense of gradual escalation. They started at maximum and found ways to exceed it. Sleep deprivation layered on cognitive testing, layered on field exercises that began before dawn and ended after midnight. Instructors delivering contradictory orders to test chaos response. Equipment checks at 030. 5-mile runs followed immediately by precision shooting that required heart rate below 60. Most candidates had expected hard. Hard they could manage. Hard had a shape. Hard had an endpoint you could see from the middle of it. What broke people wasn't the hard. It was the relentlessness, the fact that there was not one moment, not one, where the environment gave permission to exhale. Where you could drop the armor for 30 seconds and just be a tired human being before picking it back up again. By end of day 3, 2 men had voluntarily withdrawn. One was in medical with a stress fracture. Another had sat down during a night navigation exercise and declined to get up. The instructors had waited, said nothing. Eventually, one of them had walked away and come back with paperwork. Claire absorbed all of it. She was not unaffected. She'd have been lying to claim otherwise. The exhaustion lived below the muscle level, down in the bone, in tissue that didn't have a name in anatomy textbooks. She was cold in the California mornings in a way that never entirely left during the day. Running on less sleep than her body wanted, and more coffee than it needed. But she had a mechanism. Her father had called it the quiet room, not a real place. A mental space. The part of your mind that noise couldn't reach if you'd built the walls thick enough. He'd built his in combat, lying motionless for hours with insects crawling across his face, waiting for a shot that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The body will do almost anything you ask it to. He had told her once when she was 12 and complaining about November cold on a hunting trip. The body is remarkably cooperative. It's the mind that quits first. So you build a room in your mind that quitting can't get into. She went there a lot in week 1, and from inside that quiet room, she watched. What she noticed, while other candidates were too exhausted to notice anything beyond the next evolution, was pattern. Every instructor had one. A rhythm to their pressure, a timing to escalations, a logic, even when the logic was designed to appear random. Britten had a pattern too, specific. He was hardest on her not randomly, not at fixed intervals, but in the precise moments when she was performing at her best, when she finished first, when she solved a problem faster than anyone else, when she demonstrated something that could not be argued with. That was when the pressure increased. As if her excellence was the thing that most needed to be corrected. She filed that observation carefully, the way her father had taught her to file information when you didn't have a shot yet. "You're not collecting facts," he'd said. "You're building a picture, and pictures take time." She met Callum Haynes on the Thursday of week 2, 22 years old. A small town in eastern Tennessee. The kind of town with a name that sounded invented until you understood that places like that were more real than most places with impressive names. A ranger. Technically excellent in ways that showed up clearly in scores, and in the way he moved, economical, precise, the body language of someone trained well who knew it. But Callum Haynes had a problem. He fell apart under observation. The moment an instructor's eyes landed on him, something in his mechanics changed. His breathing shifted. Trigger pull went from smooth to anxious. Time slipped. Groups opened. It was like watching someone who could play piano beautifully alone in a room lose access to his own hands the second an audience arrived. Claire recognized it immediately, because she had been exactly this person at 22. Her instructor then, a master sergeant named Plunkett, who smelled permanently of chewing tobacco and carried 17 years of patience in his back pocket, had looked at her groups on day 3 and said with characteristic gentleness, "You shoot like someone who's afraid to be wrong." She'd wanted to argue. He was right. She found Callum at dusk after the formal training day ended. He was on the range running dry fire drills alone in fading light. Didn't hear her approach. Most people didn't. It wasn't something she did consciously anymore. Just a habit built deep enough that it had become automatic. "Your breathing's wrong," she said. He startled, turned, visibly recalibrating. When someone's watching, you try to control your breathing instead of letting it happen. You're fighting your own body. Your groups tell on you every time. He stared at her. "How do you?" "Because I did it for 2 years before someone pointed it out." She didn't wait for him to finish. "Your father a hunter?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "How did you?" "Because you hold before the shot the way deer hunters do. It's instinct. Right for short range. But a sniper finds the natural pause between exhale and inhale and fires inside that window. There's a difference between controlling your breath and fighting your breath." Callum looked down at his rifle, processing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Fair question. In a program where 41% didn't finish, helping someone else finish was, by some calculus, working against your own position. Because that's not how I was raised," she said. She left him there the next day. His groups tightened by 40%. Chief Burrell, the environmental block instructor, a quiet, methodical man who taught by asking questions that led you to find answers yourself, noticed immediately. Said nothing, but his expression said something. Word traveled, the way word traveled in small, high-stress groups. Quietly, quickly, with more accuracy than the people it traveled about would have preferred. By the end of week 2, something in the dynamic of the class had begun, very subtly, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The problem began on a Thursday. It began with her scope, morning exercise. Long-range engagement at 1,000 meters. A sequence of 6 targets requiring confirmed hits while moving between positions. Standard evolution shot. 2 inches high, 4 inches left. At 1,000 meters, 2 and 4 was a miss. She adjusted, confirmed a hit, moved to the next position, adjusted again. The error persisted, but differently. Not consistently, it varied, which meant it wasn't wind. A wind error was directionally consistent. Predictable in magnitude, this was random. Wrong, within a range. But random, she completed the exercise without changing her expression. Confirmed 4 of 6 targets. Still a passing score. But she knew, with a cold certainty that settled into her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water, that this was not mechanical failure. Scopes didn't develop random errors on their own. Scopes developed consistent errors. Zero shift from impact. Degraded reticle. Known skingers. Random error meant interference. That evening she stripped the scope completely, every component. Took her time, because the kind of interference she was looking for would not be found by anyone in a hurry. 90 minutes. She almost missed it. A shim, hair-thin, placed between the elevation turret and the adjustment body with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. So small that a visual inspection wouldn't catch it. So precisely positioned that its effect on point of impact would vary with the turret's position, creating exactly the kind of random-seeming error she had been experiencing. This required knowledge, access, intent. She held it under the light for a long moment, turned it between her fingers, and thought about what her father had told her once, after a hunting trip where she'd come home frustrated because the deer had seen her before she was ready. "Don't let them see the blood," he'd said. Not because wounds are shameful, but because predators are attracted to blood. You bleed privately. And you wait. She put the shim in the small zippered pocket of her kit, reassembled the scope, re-zeroed at last light, went to the mess for dinner, sat across from Callum, and talked about wind readings from the afternoon exercise and ate everything on her tray. She didn't say a word about the shim, not to anyone, not that night, not the next day. Not ever, until the time was right, and she would know when the time was right, because her father had taught her that timing was not impatience wearing a patient face. Timing was the discipline to wait for the window, and windows came. They always came. If you were paying attention, Week 2 closed with a night stalking exercise through terrain chosen for its combination of difficulties: uneven ground, limited concealment. 2 observation posts placed to maximize detection likelihood. 17 candidates completed the exercise with passing scores. Claire finished 3rd overall. She should have finished 1st. She knew her own performance. She'd run the math in her head while moving through the terrain, the way she always did. A parallel accounting. Her father's habit, adopted so early it felt like original equipment. The best way to know what had happened was to track it yourself. Her composite score, by her own calculation. 1st, not close to 1st, 1st by a margin. When the posted scores appeared on the board outside the operations building, she read them with the expression she brought to wind readings or equipment checks. Neutral, attentive, her name, 7th. Methodology note beside her entry. Technique deviations. Cited in language specific enough to sound official and vague enough to mean anything. None of the other entries had methodology notes. She was still at the board when Garrett Stoll came and stood beside her. He looked at the scores. Then at her, "That's not right," he said. Not loudly, but not quietly. "I was behind you, on approach. I watched your stalk the whole way in. It was clean. Cleaner than mine." She looked at him. "I'm not saying because I feel sorry for you," he said it flatly, like he needed to establish that first. "I'm saying it because it's what I saw." Something changed in the air between them. Not warmth exactly. Something more functional than warmth. The recognition between 2 people who see the same thing and have decided they're not going to pretend otherwise. "I know," she said. "What are you going to do?" She looked at the board for one more moment. File a discrepancy notice and keep shooting. Stoll held her gaze for a beat. Then he nodded once, clean and complete, and walked away. She filed the discrepancy notice that afternoon, through proper channels, in writing, with specific reference to the methodology note and a formal request for documentation of the observations it cited. When those observations were made, by whom, whether they were recorded in real time, or after the composite score was calculated. She did not expect the score to change. Her father had understood something about documentation, but that Miss Oldie discovered after they needed it and didn't have it. Paper has memory, he'd said. Memories fade. Paper doesn't. You put things on paper because someday someone is going to want to know what happened. And you want to be the one who already knew. She put it on paper. Then she went to dinner. 2 days later, Britten called her to his office. Small room. Functional. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that faced the range. He was standing when she entered, looking at a blank section of wall, with the focused attention of a man, using the act of looking at it to finish a thought before he had to deal with the person who had just walked in. She stood at attention and waited. He turned around, sat down, laced his fingers, looked at her with an expression she had spent 3 weeks learning to read. This was the expression he used when a conversation had already been decided before she arrived. When the outcome was not in question and this meeting was simply administrative, Sergeant Reeves, you filed a discrepancy notice. Yes, sir. You're aware that I review all performance documentation in this course. Yes. Sir, he let the weight of that settle. I've reviewed the scoring for the stalking exercise. The methodology was applied consistently. Some technique observations are not fully captured in raw data. Experienced evaluators notice things the numbers don't reflect. He paused. The kind of pause that was doing work. With respect, sir, Claire said, I'd like to know specifically what technique deviations were observed, and whether those observations were documented in real time during the exercise or added after the composite score was calculated. Something flickered across his face, not anger. Anger she would have understood. This was quieter than anger. The expression of a man who had been asked a question he did not want to answer and was deciding whether to answer it, dismiss it, or find a third option she hadn't offered him. Are you accusing me of something, Sergeant? No, sir, steady. No heat. I'm asking a procedural question. It seems like a reasonable question for a candidate to ask about a score that affected her standing. The silence that followed had weight, real weight. The kind that was doing its own work independent of either of them. You're a long way, Britten said finally, from where you think you are, not quite a threat. A statement in the shape of a threat. Yes, sir, she said. I'm aware of that. He dismissed her. She walked out of the building into evening air, into the salt smell of the Pacific coming off the bay, and stood for a moment with the cool air on her face. 30 seconds. She gave herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the full weight of it, the bone-deep exhaustion of being the best in the room, while spending half her energy fighting for the right to be seen as adequate. The grinding, relentless cost of that, not the physical cost, the other kind, the kind you couldn't measure in miles or hours or sleep deprivation because it lived somewhere those kishers couldn't reach. 30 seconds. Then she walked back to the barracks, because there was still range left to cover, and she was not done covering it. The assembly happened at 0500, not a training, evolution, an assembly. 24 candidates in formation in the pre-dawn dark, breath visible, nobody knowing the reason. The collective energy of a group, yanked from sleep and arranged in rows without explanation, had a particular texture, compressed. Wary Britten walked out, stood in front of them, did not speak for a long moment, then, "We have a candidate in this program who has filed a formal complaint questioning the integrity of this course's evaluation process." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every pair of eyes slid. 1 second, no more, to Claire. Then forward again. In 22 years of running programs at this level, Britten said, and his voice carried the flatness that was somehow worse than shouting. I have never had a candidate challenge the process this program uses to evaluate performance. Not once, he began to walk, slowly. Front of the formation, you want to know why? Because the candidates who make it into this program understand something others don't. This course doesn't owe you accuracy. It owes you truth. And the truth is that some people standing on this grinder right now do not have what this program requires, and paperwork doesn't change that. He stopped directly in front of Claire. "Are we clear, Sergeant Reeves?" "Yes, sir." Her voice was completely level, like a scope that had been properly zeroed. Britten held the pause. Let it become theater, a performance for the 23 men watching. Then he turned and walked away. What he didn't see, because he had already turned his back, and Britten rarely looked at things he'd finished performing, was Garrett Stoll, 2 positions to Claire's left, watching the back of Britten's retreating figure, with an expression that had traveled a very long distance in a very short time. Not sympathy, not outrage. Something quieter and more serious than either of those things. The look of a man who had just watched something happen that he knew was wrong, who was now, privately, without announcement, deciding what kind of man he intended to be about it. Claire felt his gaze, didn't return it, filed it. The picture was almost complete now. Chief Burrell ran the environmental block in week 4. He was not like the other instructors. Not loud, not aggressive, not the kind of man who used pressure the way a blunt instrument was used. Burrell taught by asking questions, specific questions that seemed simple until you tried to answer them, and discovered that the gap between what you thought you knew and what you actually knew was wider than you'd realized. On the second day of the block, he stood at the head of 12 candidates, on a hillside overlooking a valley. What's the wind doing at the target? Flags. At the firing line. Flags at 500 meters. Flags at 800. The target was at 950. No flag at 950. 7 candidates gave answers based on the available flags. Interpolated readings. Reasonable extrapolations. Not wrong exactly, but not right either. The kind of answer that was technically defensible and practically insufficient. Colum said nothing. He was watching the grass on the valley floor. Claire said nothing either. She was watching a Swainson's hawk, hovering at almost exactly target distance, its wings making tiny constant adjustments that told a story the flags couldn't tell because the flags were 7 feet off the ground. Wind at 7 feet was not necessarily wind at the height of a human chest. The hawk was working the air at approximately chest height for a standing target, and the adjustments it was making spoke a very specific language if you knew how to listen. Burrell waited, then, "Reeves, what are you watching?" "The hawk, Chief." "Why the hawk?" "Because it's hovering at target distance, and its wings are giving me more accurate wind data than the flags. The flags are reading surface-level air. The hawk is working at approximately center mass height for a standing target. Right now it's compensating into a right-to-left crosswind that's stronger than the flags are showing, which means the valley is funneling air in a way that surface readings don't capture. Silence. Your correction?" She gave him the number. He nodded once, not enthusiastically, not warmly. Once. The nod of a man who had received a correct answer and was acknowledging it with exactly the amount of acknowledgement it deserved. "No more. Everyone else," he said to the group. "Remember this. Wind flags are a starting point. They are not the answer." That night, Callum sat across from her in the common room, leaning against the wall, watching her clean her rifle from across the space. He had the look he got sometimes. Something working in him before it came out as words. "The hawk thing." He said, "Yeah, your father taught you that." "Yeah, did he know what he was building?" Callum asked. "Like, did he understand what all of it was going to be used for?" Claire was quiet for a moment. She thought about a hillside in Colorado, a man with a spotting scope pointing at distances, a 9-year-old girl who didn't understand yet that she was being given something most people spent their whole lives looking for and never finding. "I think," she said, slowly, "he understood exactly what he was building. I just didn't know what it was going to be used for." Callum nodded slowly. "He sounds like the kind of man who thought in longer distances than most people." She looked at her rifle. "Yeah," she said. "He really was." The dual stress protocol arrived in week 5, legitimate training tool, real purpose. The ability to perform precision work under compounded physical and mental stress was not academic, it was operational. Snipers did not choose their conditions. They performed in the conditions that existed, the protocol. Full obstacle course and kit, then immediate transition to timed precision engagement, then individual interview with an instructor panel reviewing the engagement under continued physiological monitoring. The other candidates ran the standard course. Claire ran a different one. She didn't know it until she was already inside it. The route diverged from the standard path at a junction she had memorized during the morning walkthrough, and her marker pointed left where the standard marker pointed right. Left added a mud crossing. Wet, deep, slow, approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes on a timed evolution was not 4 minutes. It was position in the sequence. Available time at the firing line. She was already moving, already committed. She made a decision in half a second. Run it. Whatever they were going to do with her score, they were going to do. She could fight it, or she could shoot. She couldn't do both at the same time. She ran it. Arrived at the firing line with mud to the knee and the clock already running, set up in the fastest time she'd ever set up. Got behind the rifle. Found her position, found her breathing, found the targets. 5 of 6 in the time remaining. The 6th was still rotating into position when the clock ended. 5 out of 6. Still passing. But not her score. The interview was conducted by a lieutenant commander named Forsyth. She hadn't dealt with Forsyth before. New faces in late-stage evaluations had a particular meaning in a program like this. He asked her to describe her decision-making during the engagement. She described it accurately and completely. He nodded. Made notes, then, with the careful casualness of a man who had rehearsed the moment. Do you feel your result today reflected your actual capability? No. Why not? Because my route through the physical phase was different from the standard route in a way that cost me 4 minutes of transition time, which reduced my available engagement window, which reduced my score. Forsyth set his pen down. That's a significant allegation, Sergeant. It's an observation. I'm happy to walk you through the route differences. I memorized both routes during this morning's walkthrough. A pause. Both routes, I noticed. My marker was different from the standard during the walkthrough. I memorized both so I'd have a reference point if the difference mattered. Another pause. Longer. Forsyth looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat longer than professional neutrality required. Then he closed his notebook. I see, he said. The score posted that evening. 5 of 6 with a notation about transition time. No mention of route variance. No explanation of why her route had differed from the standard. Just the number. Just the notation. Claire sat on her rack that night, with the barracks quiet around her, and opened her journal for the first time in weeks. Not to read the promises, to write. One sentence. Dad. I don't know if staying is the right thing anymore. She looked at that sentence for a long time. It sat there on the page looking back at her. Honest in the way that things written in the dark were honest. The kind of honest you couldn't maintain in daylight. When the armor was on and the day was moving and there wasn't space for sentences that started with I don't know. She didn't add to it. Didn't cross it out. Closed the journal, lay back, stared at the ceiling, and she stayed there. Not because she had an answer, not because the doubt had gone away, because doubt was not the same as decision. Because her father had told her once that the most dangerous moment wasn't when you were afraid. It was when fear started to feel like wisdom, when the voice that wanted you to stop had started using your own vocabulary. She lay there. She did not decide to quit. She did not decide to stay. She simply did not move, and in the morning she was still there, which was, for now, enough. Garrett Stoll found her at 0700, common room. 8 people present, coffee in hand. The kind of morning where everyone was moving through the space without quite landing in it. Stoll didn't navigate around anyone, didn't lower his voice. I want to show you something. 8 people stilled, not dramatically. The way a room stilled when something with weight entered it. He held up his phone, a photograph, clear, taken the previous morning during the walkthrough before the protocol began, route markers. Both sets. Standard path and the divergence that led left into the mud crossing. The divergence that had cost Claire 4 minutes and 1 confirmed target. I took this because I thought it was a mistake, Stoll said. I was going to ask you about it because I figured you'd noticed too. He looked at the photograph, then at her, then the exercise happened. And I figured some things out. The 8 people in the room were very still now. The kind of stillness that was also attention. I'm going to Decker, Stoll said. You can come or not. That's your call. But I'm going. He turned toward the door. From the corner of the room, a recon Marine named Price, who had spent 5 weeks maintaining a studied neutrality that was its own kind of statement, stood up, picked up his coffee cup, said to no one in particular, I'll go, and walked out after Stoll without looking back. Claire stood there for a moment. 7 of the 8 remaining people in the room were looking at her. Not with pity, not with calculation. With the specific attention people brought to moments they understood were significant. The attention that arrived before something was decided. She set her coffee down, followed them. Chief Decker's office smelled of coffee and documentation, and the particular combination that accumulated in spaces where hard decisions were made regularly. Decker was a man who said less than he thought. 14 years in this program. The kind of professional stillness that came from watching enough things resolve themselves that you'd learned to be patient with the process. He looked at Stoll's photograph for a long time, asked 3 questions, clean, specific, the questions of a man not looking for narrative, verifying facts. Then he photographed the photo with his own phone. Return to barracks, he said. Thank you. His expression as they left was the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a sum he didn't particularly like. Britten called Claire to his office that evening. She had expected anger, had been bracing for it internally, the way you braced for a wave you could see building from a distance. Anger would have been manageable. Anger had a shape. She knew what to do with anger. What she got was different. Britten was sitting behind his when she entered, and for the first time since she'd known him, since the first morning on the grinder, he looked tired, not physically tired, the other kind, the kind from carrying something heavier than fatigue, from holding a position against something for so long that the holding had become its own exhaustion. He didn't speak for nearly 30 seconds. Then, the route variance in the dual stress protocol has been classified as an administrative error. She said nothing. Your score for the exercise will be recalculated based on the standard transition window. The adjusted score reflects 6 of 6 confirmed engagements. She said nothing. He looked at her then. And for the first time in 5 weeks, the first time since the morning on the grinder, he looked at her without the current running underneath. Without the assessment, without the pressure that had been present in every interaction they'd had. He just looked at her, the way one person looked at another person when the wall between them had developed a crack neither of them intended. Is there anything you want to say? No, sir. Something moved in his expression, subtle. But there, dismissed, she walked out. Into the hallway outside his office, she stopped. Put her back against the wall, closed her eyes, 10 seconds, just 10. And in those 10 seconds, she let herself feel the full weight of 5 weeks. Not the physical weight, the other weight. The accumulated cost of remaining unbroken when the pressure was specifically, deliberately designed to break her. The particular exhaustion of being the best in the room while spending half her energy fighting for the right to be seen as adequate. 10 seconds, she felt all of it. Then she opened her eyes. Walked back to the barracks, because there were 3 weeks of training remaining and a steel target in a fat canyon that had been waiting 32 years. It could wait a little longer. Something shifted after that, not dramatically, not all at once. The kind of shift that happened when enough small things changed direction simultaneously that the overall vector picture changed without any single identifiable moment. Candidates who had previously moved away from her table at the mess started sitting nearby. Questions that would have gone to Decker or Burrell began being directed quietly to her. Price, who had maintained studied neutrality for 5 weeks, came to her before a night stalking exercise and said, without preamble, "What would you look for on the approach?" Then, "You don't have to answer," she answered. He listened the way serious people listened, not just with ears. With the part of a person that knew the difference between information they could actually use and information that only sounded useful. He completed the exercise with the best individual time in the class. Afterward, he found her. "It worked," he said. "I know. How did you know it would?" "Because my father taught me the same thing." "And it worked for me," he nodded. "Where's your father now?" She looked at him for a moment. "He's why I'm here," she said, which was true in every way that mattered. The last night of week 5, Callum came and sat across from her in the common room. Something to say. She could tell from the way he sat, slightly forward. The posture of a person who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. "There's a guy in 3rd platoon," he said. "Harmon. Been struggling with the night nav work. Low light doesn't suit everyone." She kept cleaning. "I talked him through a checkpoint problem tonight," Callum said. He was about to change his heading. "I just told him to breathe and look at the terrain instead of the map. Said the terrain was the map, if you read it right. Said the map was just someone else's description of something you could see directly." She looked up. He hit the checkpoint. 30 seconds later, she looked at him. "You just told him something your father told you." Callum blinked, then realized. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I did." Something very quiet and very real moved through the space between them in that moment. Not sentiment. Something with more weight than sentiment. The recognition of how things move through people. How something, given in a deer-blind Colorado, could travel forward through time in ways nobody planned for. Reach people nobody had imagined. "That's how it works," Claire said. "He didn't teach me things for me. He taught me things because things needed to be taught. And I didn't learn them for me either." Callum was quiet. "For who?" She looked back at her rifle. "For whoever needs them next," she said. Outside, the base had gone quiet. The Pacific moved against the coast the way it had moved before any of them were born, and would keep moving after all of them were gone. In Britten's office, the light was still on. In the gear bay, Stoll was running late maintenance checks on his kit, with the methodical focus of a man who worked better when his hands were occupied. And Claire Reeves cleaned rifle of Nevada 3 days away now. The transport scheduled for Monday morning, the desert, the canyon. The target that had been waiting since 1993 for someone who understood that patience was not the absence of motion. It was the discipline to wait for the right moment to move. Who understood that wind couldn't be beaten, only read, only timed, only used in the brief windows when it offered itself. She thought about the shim in her kit pocket. She thought about a blank wall in Britten's office. She thought about a photograph face down on a desk. A woman in uniform, mid-law, squinting into sunlight that had existed 21 years ago. She didn't know the woman's name yet, but she was beginning to understand the shape of the story. And stories. Her father had told her once on a hillside in Colorado, pointing at a ridgeline, Kanlai, that looked impossibly far away, always made more sense when you were looking back at them. The hard part was living forward through the middle of them. "But you live forward," he'd said. "You read the terrain. You find the window. And you trust the shot." She clicked the final component of her rifle back into place. Lay down, stared at the ceiling. 3 days to Nevada. 3 days to Ghost Target 7. 32 years of impossible waiting. At the end of 1,400 meters, she closed her eyes. She wasn't afraid, she was ready. Which, her father had always told her, was the same thing as grateful. The transport left at 0400 in the morning was not night and not day. The hour that belonged to neither, when the world hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. When things that needed to happen before the noise started could happen quietly, without the weight of daylight, making everything feel observed. 17 candidates. That was what remained. 7 had left the program in 5 weeks, 2 voluntary withdrawals, 2 medical drops, 2 performance cuts. One who had gone somewhere inside himself that nobody could reach, and had been quietly removed before anyone had to make it official. 17 from 24. Every one of them knew what the next 4 days meant. Nevada. The final qualification range. Ghost Target 7. Nobody talked much on the bus. Soldiers in the final approach to something significant went quiet in a particular way. The way people went quiet before a verdict was read. The energy on that bus was compressed and dense, and sitting just below the surface of every face, Claire sat near the window in the 3rd row, eyes open, not watching the highway disappear into pre-dawn dark, doing what she always did in the hours before something mattered, listening inward, uttering everything her father had taught her, not as a checklist, more like a conversation. The way you talked to someone who wasn't in the room anymore, but whose voice you still knew clearly enough to hear. Column was across the aisle. He hadn't slept either after a while. Maybe 2 hours in, the sky beginning to consider becoming light without committing to it, he said quietly, not looking at her. You nervous? Yes, he seemed surprised by the honesty of it. Me too, he said. Good, she said. Nervous means you understand what's at stake. People who aren't nervous before something like this either don't care or don't understand. Neither of those is who you want next to you. He was quiet for a moment. My hands are shaking, he said, very quietly. Like a confession. They'll stop when you start shooting, she said. They always do. The body knows what to do. It's the waiting that makes it shake. Some of the tension went out of his shoulders, chosen. He didn't say anything else. That was enough. 3 rows back, Garrett Stoll sat with his arms crossed and his eyes closed. If you didn't know better, you'd have thought he was sleeping. But the angle of his jaw said something different. The jaw of a man thinking very hard about something, and using the closed eyes to do it privately. In the front vehicle, separate from the candidates. Britain's standard procedure. Also, on this particular morning, something that felt like more than procedure, the Nevada facility arrived as the sky was deciding to commit, not dramatic about it. Not the kind of sunrise that showed off, just light increasing slowly over high desert until the terrain resolved from shadow into something readable. Scrub, rock, elevation. The kind of landscape on it about what it was. Sparse, dry. Cold in the particular way high desert was cold. Not wet cold, not coastal cold. The kind of cold that was what it said it was and didn't apologize. The canyon system stretched beyond the facility into distances that took your breath. Not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they were indifferent. The mountains had built this place over millions of years without concern for what humans would eventually try to do with it. Claire stepped off that transport and stood for a moment, breathed the air. High desert air was different from coastal air, thinner, drier, clean and cool and staying in your lungs. She had spent time in terrain like this before. The kind that made you feel simultaneously very small and very present. The kind that required attention or it would take something from you. She paid attention. Always. Day 1 was acclimation and qualification prelims. Long-range cold bore confirmation at 800 meters. Then 1,000. Then 1,250 environmental assessment exercises. Unknown distance target engagement across varied terrain. The instructors watched, took notes. Said very little. Claire shot clean on every evolution. 800 meters, 1 round. Confirmed hit point 1,000 meters, 1 round. Confirmed hit. Dead center 1,250 meters. 1 round. Decker was behind the spotting scope when the round connected dead center, exactly where she had put it. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. Mark center. Good shot, Reeves. Same tone he used for everyone, except he didn't move the scope away. She could see, in her peripheral vision, already back in position, that he was still looking at the target. She filed that away. Day 2 was when Ghost Target 7 entered the conversations. For real, Britten gathered the class at the rim of the primary canyon after the morning evolution, stood with his back to the valley below, the canyon behind him, the sky above, 17 candidates in front, wind moving through everything. He had a way of positioning himself against geography without appearing to think about it. The kind of thing that became instinct after long enough. Before we begin the afternoon block, he said, I want to talk about what you'll face on the final day. He let a pause do work. Ghost Target 7 has been in this canyon since 1993, 32 years. It was placed by the original design team as a theoretical maximum engagement, a target set at the edge of what physics and human skill combined could reasonably achieve. 1,400 meters. Canyon influence on wind. Thermal variables that change with time of day. A target profile that presents a realistic engagement surface but leaves no margin for error. He walked the formation slowly. In 32 years, this course has cycled through over 800 candidates. Every qualifying class attempts Ghost Target 7 on the final day. Every qualifying class walks away without a confirmed hit. He stopped. This is not a criticism of those candidates. They were exceptional shooters. Many of them are serving right now, doing things most people in this country will never know about. The target is not unbeaten because those men were insufficient. Another pause, then he looked directly at Claire. Physics says so, he said. Just that. Just those 3 words. And then he moved on to the afternoon schedule, like it was a passing remark end. But it wasn't a passing remark, and every one of the 17 people in that formation understood it at the same frequency. Column, walking beside Claire back toward the range, said in a voice barely above a murmur, That was directed at you, I know. Does it bother you? She thought about it honestly. It lights something, she said. Whether that's useful depends on what I do with it. Stoll fell into step on her other side. Sits. He's setting the story before the ending, Stoll said. Whatever happens tomorrow, he wants the narrative already written. I know, Claire said. So what's your story? She looked forward. Same one it's always been, she said. That evening, after the day's formal training ended, Claire went to the canyon alone, not to the firing line, not to where the target was, to the rim, a point above and between the firing position and the target. She had identified it that afternoon, during the range orientation walk, a spot where you could see the full length of the engagement. Watch the canyon the way her father had taught her to watch terrain, not for what you expected to find. For what was actually there, she sat down on the rock, and she watched for 2 hours. The wind in the canyon did not behave like wind in open terrain. She had known this theoretically from the briefing materials, but theory and observation were different things. Theory was someone else's description of something you could see directly, what she could see directly. The canyon walls creating compression and deflection patterns that interacted with each other in complex, layered ways. The kind of interaction that made surface wind readings, the flags at the firing line, the flags at 500 meters, an approximation of something more complicated than they were built to capture. On the surface, from the firing line, the flags told a story. From above, watching actual air movement, indicated by dust and plant behavior, and insects moving along the rock faces, she could see the flags were describing one chapter of a longer story. She watched. At 47 minutes, she saw it in the dust along the canyon floor, below the target, approximately 200 meters past the midpoint of the engagement, a rotation. Not random movement, not linear. Rotational. The air in the lower canyon was forming a thermal pocket. A column of warm air rising and cycling in the confined space created by the rock walls at that specific geometry. She watched it complete one cycle, started counting. Watched it complete again, 11 seconds. Watched it 6 more times. 11, 11, 11, 10 and a half, 11, 11, consistent within the variance of air temperature fluctuation, which was itself predictable based on time of day. Her heart rate went up. Approximately 10 beats per minute. The physical response to recognizing something significant. She brought it back down because this was not a solution yet. This was a variable. Identifying a variable was not the same as accounting for it. She needed to understand what the thermal pocket did to a round traveling through it at 1,400 meters. She needed the bullet's time for flight under these specific conditions. She needed to understand at what point, in the Leveson cycle, the rotating air created a window. Specific window, where its influence on the round's path dropped from unaccountable to workable. She sat on the rim. Did the math in her head. 1 more hour. When she walked back to the facility, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon high. The stars over the Nevada desert were doing what stars over the desert did, stating themselves clearly. Without qualification, Decker was outside the operations building, a cigarette. The unapologetic dedication of a man who had made his peace with his habits. He watched her walk in from the direction of the canyon. Didn't ask where she'd been. Just watched, and finished his cigarette. Day 3 was the formal qualification block. Findful evaluations before Ghost Target 7. Long-range precision. Stalking, unknown distance engagement. A scenario exercise that compressed everything they'd done in 6 weeks, into a single simulated operational context. Claire finished first overall, not by a small margin, by 11 points. Decker checked the numbers twice, called Burrell over and had him check them independently. Burrell looked at the numbers, looked at Decker, said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. What happened next? Moved through the barracks, the way fire moved through dry brush. Price told Callum. Callum told 2 rangers. The rangers told Stoll. Stoll stood in the middle of the barracks and said to everyone within earshot, which was everyone. In a voice that was not performing anything, she finished first overall. By 11 points, someone, nobody admitted it afterward, but it happened. Started a slow clap. 4 seconds before discipline reasserted itself. 4 seconds was enough. 4 seconds was a declaration. The kind that didn't need a speech. Colum sat on his rack with a grin. He wasn't managing. Claire was cleaning her rifle. She heard all of it, and her hands. Just for a moment, just for the space of one breath, went completely still. Not because she'd stopped cleaning, because she was letting herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. The accumulated weight of 6 weeks. The exhaustion and the grind, and the mornings where the quiet room was the only thing that held. The shim in the pocket of her kit. The score posted 7th. The assembly in the dark and Britten's voice saying, "Some people don't have what it takes," with her standing 2 feet in front of him. The sentence in the journal, "Dad, I don't know if staying is the right thing anymore." She thought about the piece of paper inside a Bible on a shelf in a farmhouse in Colorado. 3 promises, 2 down, 1 left. She picked up the cleaning rod and kept going. Britten received the qualification scores in his office that evening, sat with them for a long time. Decker had brought them personally. Not standard protocol for score delivery, which meant Decker had done it deliberately. To be in the room when Britten read them, Britten looked at the numbers. His expression didn't change. His breathing didn't change. She finished first, Decker said. "I can see that. By 11 points, I can see that too." Decker was quiet for a moment. "She went to the canyon last night. After training. Stayed 2 hours. Alone." Britten looked up. "Watching," Decker said. "Just watching. I could see her on the rim from the ops building." Silence. "She's going to make that shot tomorrow," Decker said. Not like a prediction. Not like a challenge. The way someone stated something they knew to be true and needed another person to know they knew it. Britten set the score sheet down. "The shot is impossible," he said. "You've been saying that for 12 years, Decker replied. "Because it's true," Decker looked at his commanding officer. He had served with for 11 years. A man he knew not all of, but enough of. He knew about the photograph face down on the desk every night. He knew the shape of what it was even without knowing the details. "Colonel," he said carefully, "I think you should watch her shoot tomorrow. Really watch. Not as a commander. Not as a grader, as what Decker thought about it. As someone who might be wrong," he said quietly. The silence that followed was long. Britten didn't respond. He picked up the score sheet again, looked at the number. 11 points, looked at it the way a man looked at something, quietly rearranging the furniture of his certainties, not welcoming it, not stopping it, just unable to make it stop. The fourth day arrived, with the particular silence normally got understood. They were going to matter. Claire was awake before the alarm. She lay in the dark for 60 seconds, eyes open, just breathing, letting the day arrive. Then she got up, dressed, went through her pre-shoot ritual with the rifle. Went to the mess for coffee she could barely taste. Column was already there. He looked at her over his mug. "How do you feel?" "Ready," she said. He waited, and grateful, she said. He blinked. Of all the words he'd expected, that one hadn't been on the list. "For what?" She wrapped both hands around her mug. "For the fact that I get to find out," she said. At 108, 17 candidates assembled at the primary firing line. The canyon stretched ahead and below. And 1,400 meters away, invisible to the naked eye, Ghost Target 7 waited exactly where it had been waiting for 32 years. The rules were simple. One shot, each candidate. One. The instructors were not there to coach. They were there to observe and to confirm if the impossible somehow became possible. Britten stood slightly apart from the group. He had not looked at Claire differently than the others all morning. But something in the set of his posture told Decker, who was watching both of them, that the colonel was bracing for something. The way a man braced when he was no longer certain of the thing he had always been certain of, and could feel the uncertainty arriving, whether he wanted it to or not. The first candidate stepped to the line. A ranger named Bosch, composed, technically excellent, one of the top 5 shooters in the class. He set up, made his environmental read, applied his calculations, fired, miss, drifted left. The canyon had taken it. Second candidate, miss, high third, miss. By the 6th miss, the energy on the line had settled into something heavy and collective. These were not bad shots. These were excellent shots under genuinely extreme conditions, and the conditions were winning. Stoll was the 9th shooter. He set up with a methodical precision that had characterized everything he did in this program. 45 seconds on his environmental read, adjusted, pied fired. The round hit the canyon wall 12 feet below the target. Stoll stood up from his position, looked at the impact point through his spotter scope, said one word that nobody repeated afterward, but everyone heard. Then he stepped back, turned to Claire, who was standing 2 positions to his left. The wind in the lower third is doing something the flags aren't showing. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. "You figured it out." "I think so. Last night." "On the rim, yes." He stared at her for a long moment, then roughly, directly. The way Garrett Stoll said everything he actually meant, "Then go hit it." Candidates 10 through 16 shot in sequence. Price came the closest. His round pawn passed within 3 feet of the target before the canyon claimed it. He stepped back and stood there looking at where the round had gone, without speaking. And then there was one candidate left. Britten stepped forward. His voice carried across the entire range. All 17 candidates. All the instructors. The wind moving through everything. "No one can make that shot," he said. "Not today, not ever." He looked directly at Claire. "Physics says so." Same words as the briefing. "Harder now. Sharper. A last wall erected specifically for her to run into. Claire stepped to the line. She didn't look at Britten. She didn't look at the other candidates, or the instructors, or the spotting scopes, or the wind flags that had already failed 16 shooters this morning. She stepped to the firing line, lowered herself behind the rifle, and the world, the entire loud, complicated, exhausting world she had been navigating for 6 weeks, went quiet. Not silent, quiet. The difference mattered. Silence was the absence of sound. Quiet was a choice, a discipline. A room her father had taught her to build when she was young enough that the lesson had become architecture rather than memory. Decker moved to the spotting scope behind and to her left. He had spotted for hundreds of candidates on this range. His face behind the eyepiece gave nothing away, but his right hand resting on his knee had closed into a loose fist. Unconscious. The thing a body did when it was holding tension it hadn't acknowledged yet. Burrell stood 6 feet to Decker's right, clipboard in hand. Not writing on it, Britten stood apart from everyone. 12 feet back, arms at his sides. Watching, the 17 candidates arranged themselves, the way soldiers arranged themselves around something significant. Not a formal formation. Something more organic. People gravitating toward a center, the way they did when they understood that whatever was about to happen was the kind of thing you wanted to be close to. Callum was at the left edge of the group. His hands weren't shaking anymore. He had told Claire 3 days ago on the bus that his hands shook from waiting. He wasn't waiting now. He was watching. And the difference between those two things had steadied him completely. Stoll stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on the back of Claire's head, with an expression that, if you had been paying attention to Garrett Stoll for 6 weeks, was completely unlike anything he had shown before. Not admiration exactly. Though there was some of that, something closer to witness, the conscious decision to be present and attentive for something that mattered, not passively, actively. The way a serious person attended to serious things. Claire settled into her position, and she did not immediately look through the scope. This was the first thing Decker noticed. The thing that made his right hand close slightly tighter. Every other candidate had gone straight to the scope. Instinctive. The way you reached for the thing you trusted most when you needed information. Claire was looking at the canyon, not through optics, with her eyes. Watching Decker had been a sniper instructor for 14 years. He had watched more people shoot than he could count, and he had learned, over those 14 years, to read what a shooter was doing in the seconds before they fired with the same accuracy that a good shooter read a target. What he saw right now was not someone managing nerves, not someone working through a calculation. What he saw was someone listening. She was watching the canyon the way you watched something you had studied and understood, looking for a specific moment you had already identified and were waiting to see again. Patient but not passive. Alert with a quality different from urgency. The alertness of someone who had done the hard work already and was now simply waiting for the window. He understood suddenly and completely what she had been doing on the canyon the previous evening. What is she doing? Burrell said quietly beside him. Watching. Decker said, watching what? Decker moved his eye to the spotting scope, slowly traversed it across the canyon floor, below the target, looking for what she was looking for. 20 seconds, and then he found it. A pattern in the dust along the canyon bottom. Something rotational, something he had not noticed in 12 years of working this range. And he understood, looking at it, that it had been there the whole time. Every qualification, every candidate, every attempted engagement on target 7 for 32 years. And nobody sat on the rim for 2 hours and watched long enough to find it. Chief, he said, almost to himself. What? Burrell said. Decker didn't answer. Because if what he was seeing was accurate, if the woman, lying behind that rifle, had found what he thought she had found, then Colonel Walter Britten was about to be wrong. For the first time in 32 years of being right. Claire pressed her cheek to the stock. The position was perfect. Not mechanically perfect in the trained sense. Perfect in the way that revealed when something had moved past technique into instinct. Her body wasn't working to maintain the position. The position simply was. Like a word in a language you'd spoken your whole life. You didn't conjugate it anymore. You just used it. The rifle was an extension of something deeper than muscle. She found the target in the scope. At 1,400 meters, it was small. Not impossibly small. She had been shooting at comparable dimensions, at comparable distances for years. But small, at this specific range, in this specific canyon. Small was a different kind of challenge than on an open range. She took a breath, let it out, found the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale. That still half-second between when the lungs emptied and when they began to fill again. The window her father had called the quiet moment. The only moment when your body was genuinely at rest. She did not fire. Let the window pass, took the next breath, and started counting the thermal cycle in the lower canyon, ran 11 seconds with a half-second variance. She had identified this from the rim the previous evening, had run the math in her head for an hour afterward. At the 9th second of each cycle, the rotating air reached its point of maximum angular displacement from the target line. The moment when the air it was moving was briefly, for approximately 1.5 seconds, moving parallel to the bullet's path, through the critical zone rather than across it. 1.5 seconds. In that window, the thermal's influence on the round's path dropped from unaccountable to workable. Her father. You don't beat conditions you can't control. You wait for the moment the conditions give you what you need. And you're ready when they do. She was ready. A minute had passed since she'd settled into position. Long enough that some candidates were exchanging glances, wondering. Stoll didn't exchange anything with anyone. He didn't move. Price to Stoll's left. What is she waiting for? Stoll didn't answer. Seriously, what is? Quiet said. Not harshly, just the word itself. A boundary. Price went quiet. Claire was at 7. The dust pattern along the canyon floor was cycling. She could see it from the firing line. Now, she had spent 2 hours learning exactly what to look for. 8 seconds. She let out the breath she was holding. Slow, natural, controlled without being forced. Let it complete. Found the pause. 9 seconds. The air in the canyon shifted. She perceived it through the accumulated evidence of every indicator she'd been reading since she set up. The dust pattern. The heat shimmer between herself and the target flattening into the orientation she'd been waiting for. A Swainson's hawk that had been circling above the target stopped circling. Started riding a thermal with different characteristics than 30 seconds ago. The mirage between herself and ghost target shifted, flattened. There. Right there. The window she had spent 2 hours on a cold Nevada rim calculating how to find. She didn't think. Thinking was for the preparation. This moment was for the trust. She fired. The rifle moved. The sound cracked across the canyon and broke apart into echo. Came back from both walls simultaneously. A doubled percussion rolling away into the mountain air and the 32 years of silence that had preceded it. The bullet was already gone, already invisible, already somewhere in the 1,400 meters of canyon air between the firing line and ghost target 7. Nobody breathed. Decker was at the spotting scope. Target centered, watching 1 second, 1.5. 2 seconds. At 1/9 Klombiken's clang. The sound came back from the canyon 2 full seconds after the shot. Metal on metal. Clean. Unmistakable. The sound of a steel target, struck by a round that had traveled exactly where it was sent. For the first time in 32 years, Decker pulled his eye from the scope. He looked at Burrell. Burrell was staring at him with an expression Decker had never seen on Burrell's face in 11 years of working alongside him. Pure, unguarded, open-mouthed shock. Dead center, Decker said. His voice was completely flat, completely controlled, because if he let any of what he was actually feeling into his voice right now. It would come out as something entirely inappropriate for a chief petty officer on an active training range. Dead center, Burrell said. Dead center. Behind them, the canyon was still sending back echoes. And then everything happened at once. Colum Haynes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Something raw and involuntary from a place below language. Both hands on top of his head, looking at the canyon, and then at Claire, and then at the canyon again. Like the distance between those two things had suddenly become impossible to process. Price said, flatly and with complete sincerity, "Holy God." Stoll turned away from the range. He turned away and put one hand over his mouth and stood there for a moment with his back to everything. Nobody looked at him during that moment, which was the right call. Claire was still in position. She hadn't moved. Still behind the rifle. Still at the firing line. Still looking through the scope. At a steel target 1,400 meters away. Then slowly she stood up, stepped back from the firing line, turned around, and she looked at the faces of the 16 men looking at her. She looked at Decker, at Burrell, and then, steadily, directly, without hurry, she looked at Colonel Walter Britten. Britten had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been standing when he said, "Not today, not ever." And he had not moved in the 90 seconds since the sound had come back from the canyon. Arms at his sides, looking at Claire, with an expression that was doing something complicated and private that no one watching could have picked with any precision. Not anger. Past anger. Something that anger eventually became when it ran out of oxygen. Something raw and less defended. Something that had been underneath the anger the whole time, using the anger as a wall. The wall had just come down, silence stretched. Stoll turned back around, looked at Britten, looked at Claire, made no move to speak. Decker cleared his throat. "Confirmed hit," he said. Loud. Formal. The way confirmations were stated on a range. "Ghost target 7. Round 1. Center mass." Nobody cheered. Not immediately, because the magnitude of what had just happened was still category in 17 minds. Processing it 17 different ways. It Colum who started it. Of course, it was Callum. He started clapping. Single deliberate claps spaced a beat apart. Not celebration exactly. Something more like what happened when standing ovations weren't large enough for what you were watching. Price joined him. Then Burrell, who set his clipboard down, clapped with both hands in a way that suggested he had stopped caring, what was appropriate for an instructor on an active training range. Then Stoll. Stoll's clap was different from the others. Single, hard, both hands. The clap of a man who had changed his mind about something important over 6 weeks and was acknowledging it without a speech, without explanation, without qualification. It built all 17 candidates. Both instructors, Britons, stood at the back and did not clap, but he did not look away. He looked at Claire Reeves standing at the firing line of Ghost Target 7. And whatever was happening on his face was happening at a depth that hadn't been touched in a very long time. Claire let it wash over her for 5 seconds. Then she picked up her rifle, slung it, walked off the firing line to a spot 20 feet from the group. Far enough for privacy, close enough that she wasn't hiding. She reached into the breast pocket of her uniform, took out a photograph, worn at the edges, creased from years of pocket carry. A man and a girl on a hillside in Colorado, mountains enormous behind them. The man had a spotting scope. The girl was looking through a rifle almost as big as she was. She was grinning, on the back, in her own handwriting, from the night he died. She didn't read it. She knew what it had said. She just held the photograph and looked at the man in it, the man who had given her the quiet room, the patience, the knowledge that wind didn't lie, that animals told the truth about air. That impossible was just a word that hadn't met the right preparation yet. She stood there for a long time. She became aware of her surroundings gradually. The group had mostly moved back toward the operations building. The range was beginning to resume the ordinary business of a place that had witnessed something extraordinary and was slowly returning to itself. Almost everyone had gone. One person hadn't. Colonel Walter Britten was standing 10 feet away. He had been standing there long enough that he had clearly watched her with the photograph, and he hadn't interrupted it. He wasn't interrupting it now, just there, waiting, in the awkward and uncharacteristic way of a man who had something he needed to say and didn't know how to begin, because men like Britten always knew how to begin. Except now, except here, Claire put the photograph back in her pocket, looked at him. For the first time in 6 weeks, the look between them didn't have a current running through it. No challenge, no pressure, no assessment, no wall. Just two people standing on opposite sides of something that had just fundamentally changed. Britten looked at the ground for a moment, then at the canyon, then back at her. His jaw worked once. "How long did you spend up there?" he said finally. "On the rim. Last night, 2 hours. You found the thermal cycle." "Yes, sir." He was quiet. "No one has ever done that," he said, "in 32 years. Nobody has gone to that rim much long enough to find the pattern." She said nothing. "I reviewed the original design documentation this morning," he said. "The installation team's notes from 1993. They identified the thermal pattern during the design phase and classified it as too irregular to be usable." A pause. "They were wrong. They weren't watching the right things," Claire said quietly. Something in that answer landed somewhere in him. "No," he said after a moment. "They weren't." Silence. Longer this time. The canyon sent a low sound across the distance. Wind moving through rock. The sound that had been happening in this valley before any human came here, and would keep happening long after. Then Britten said, "My sister's name was Meg." Claire went still. She had not expected that. She had expected many things from this conversation. An acknowledgement, a formal comment on the shot, possibly a carefully managed cessation of hostilities. She had not expected this. She was 26. Britten continued. His voice was different now. Not flat, not commanding, not the instrument of authority it had been for 6 weeks. A voice that had set something down that it had been carrying a long distance. She was trying to become the first woman to complete an advanced selection pipeline. 2004. She was brilliant. Best athlete in our family by a significant margin. Our father called her relentless. He paused. She made it to week 11. The pressure broke her. Not the physical pressure, the other kind. The kind that came at you from every direction when you were the only one in the room, and everyone in the room had decided what you were before you opened your mouth. He stopped. Collected himself. She never came back from it. Not completely. Claire was very still. 2 weeks before she broke, Britten said, "She asked me whether I thought she belonged there." He stopped, and I said I didn't know. The silence that followed was its own kind of weight. "I have spent 21 years, Britten said, believing that protecting women from that kind of pressure was the right thing. That a program for like this cost more than it gave back. That my job was to make sure nobody else's Meg walked through a door that was going to take something from her she couldn't get back." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about what protection means. And I was wrong about what it costs when you make that decision for someone else." He paused. "What I didn't tell you is that the reason I said I didn't know when she asked me if she belonged was that I was afraid of the answer. Not her answer. Mine. I was afraid that if I said yes and she didn't make it anyway, I would have been wrong. And I'd spent 30 years not being wrong about things like that." Something in the air between them shifted. "I chose being right over being honest with my sister." He looked at her steadily. "That is not an excuse. It is an explanation. There is a difference." Claire was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry about Meg," she said. "I mean that." He nodded. "I know you do," he said. The wind moved through the canyon again. "So did Meg," Claire said quietly. "She belonged there too." Something moved across Britten's face. Fast, private, very deep. Yes, he said after a moment. Just that. Yes, she did. He straightened. Took a breath. Sergeant Reeves, he said. His voice had returned to something close to its usual register, but not entirely. Something in it had changed, not the command, the weight behind the command. What it was carrying now, that was the finest single shot I have witnessed in 22 years of this program. She held his, "Thank you, sir," he nodded once, clean and complete. Then he extended his hand. She shook it. He held it for one beat longer than a formal handshake had required. And in that one beat was everything that didn't have words. He released her hand, turned, walked back toward the operations building. His walk was the same as it had always been. The walk of a man who carried authority in his posture without performing it. But something was different. Something in the set of his shoulders had changed by approximately 3 degrees, not much. But at 1,400 meters, 3 degrees was the difference between a miss and dead center. Decker was waiting by the operations building door. He had watched the whole thing from 40 feet away and hadn't pretended otherwise. When Britten reached him, Decker looked at his commanding officer's face and read it the way he read targets. With attention, with experience, with the willingness to accept what he saw rather than what he'd expected. What he saw made him exhale slowly through his nose. "Well," Decker said. "Don't," Britten said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say I told you so." Decker considered. "I was going to say it considerably more diplomatically than that," he said, and Britten, for the first time in 6 weeks, possibly longer, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Half a second. Gone. But it had been there. The formal graduation was the following morning. 3 flag officers present. Decker had told Claire the night before, quietly, in the hallway. They specifically requested this graduation, not in general. "Because of the shot," she said. "These things travel fast," he said. When they called her name, Admiral Harmon, who had not spoken during the ceremony, stood up. One person standing when another person's name is called is a statement. An admiral standing was a statement with additional weight. Then Decker stood. Burrell stood. 2 other commanders stood. All 16 remaining candidates stood. Family members, who didn't fully understand the context, stood because they understood something significant was happening and chose to be part of it. Stoll was on his feet before the applause fully started, standing straight, both hands in his face. The face of a man proud to be in the room, calm, standing at attention in the line of graduates, was not successfully maintaining a military expression. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the overhead lighting. Claire stepped forward and received her commendation from Admiral Harmon personally. He shook her hand, held it for a moment, said something nobody else was close enough to hear. Later, Callum was asked what Harmon had said. He said he didn't know. Stoll was asked. He said he didn't know either. When Claire herself was asked, she smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached everything. "Something my father would have agreed with," she said. Nobody pushed further. Some answers were better protected. After the ceremony, Britten crossed the room with intention. Not hurrying, not performing. Moving directly from the back wall to where Claire was standing with Callum and Price near the front. The room noticed. The way a room noticed when something was happening that didn't have a precedent. Britten stopped in front of her. Callum took a half step back, not deference. The instinct to give space to something that needed it. Britten reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket, removed an official envelope, held it in both hands for a moment. Not the standard way to hold an envelope. That non-standard gesture communicated something about the weight he was assigning to it. "Official battlefield promotion recommendation," he said. "Signed this morning. Submitted through proper channels. It also includes a personal commendation for the highest individual score in the recorded history of this program." He extended it. She took it. "Not as charity," he said. Low enough that it was essentially a private conversation in a room full of people. not as politics, not as acknowledgement of something I was pressured to acknowledge. He met her gaze as respect, earned shot by shot over 6 weeks by a soldier who is better at this than anyone I have trained in 22 years. The room was quiet the way rooms went quiet when they understood they were inside a moment and chose not to interrupt it. Claire looked at the envelope, then at Britten. "What changed?" she asked. "Direct. Without ornamentation. I spent 6 weeks trying to make you quit," he said. "You didn't. And the reason you didn't wasn't stubbornness, wasn't pride." He held her gaze. "It was because you had something to say for." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "So did Meg," she said gently. Something moved across his face again. "That fast, private, very deep thing." "Yes," he said. "She did." He straightened. "Congratulations, Sergeant Reeves, on a shot that 32 years of this program said couldn't be made. And on 6 weeks that I hope you'll allow me to learn from, long after you leave this command." He extended his hand. She shook it. "That one extra beat, everything that didn't have words then." He nodded once, turned, walked back across the room. Stoll, who had watched all of it from 8 feet away, let out a slow breath he'd apparently been holding since Britten started crossing the room. Looked at Claire. Raised one eyebrow. "Close your mouth," she said. He closed it. "Was that—" He started. "Yes. Did he just—" "Yes." Stoll looked at the back of Britten's retreating figure. "Huh," he said. Which for Geert Stoll was an entire speech. That night, after the reception and the administrative processing, and the conversations that happened at the end of long, hard things, when people were figuring out how to say goodbye without making it too large, Claire went to the barracks alone, sat on the edge of her rack. The room was empty. The others still in common areas, wringing the last hours out of something that was ending. She took the photograph from her breast pocket, held it in both hands. The man with the spot, the girl with the grin, Colorado mountains behind them, that had been there before either of them was born, and would be there long after both of them were gone. She thought about the quiet room he had built inside her. She thought about a deer blind at age 9, learning that silence was information. She thought about the way he had described wind, not as a problem to solve, as a truth to read. She thought about his hands, which had been a sniper's hands, steady and precise, and which had been, at the end, too thin in hers when she held them. She thought about that last night, the chair by the window, the mountains catching the last light. His voice mostly breath. "You already know everything I taught you. Now you just have to trust it." She had trusted it. Through a tampered scope and falsified scores, and 6 weeks of a man using his authority to try to make her disappear. She had trusted it on a canyon rim in the Nevada, dark, counting thermal cycles in the dust. She had trusted it at a firing line with 16 failed shots before her, and 32 years of impossibility built into the air between her and a steel target that physics had claimed as its own. She had trusted it. And it had held. She opened the journal, 3 lines, her own handwriting, copied from a piece of paper inside a Bible, on a shelf in a farmhouse in Colorado that was sitting empty now. But not silent. Forward with honor. Checked. Never quit. Checked. Become the sniper they said you couldn't be. She held the pen over the 3rd line for a long moment. Then she drew a single checkmark, small, clean. Decisive. She sat with it, did not close the journal immediately. Let herself feel the full weight of what that mark meant. Not just the shot. Not just the score. The weight of every morning she had gotten up when staying down would have been easier. Every time she had gone to the quiet room instead of the door. Every mile her father had walked with her in those Colorado hills, teaching her to see what was really there. She thought about Meg Britten, who had asked the wrong person whether she belonged and received the wrong answer. She thought about every woman who had stood at a door and been told by the architecture of the room that the door wasn't hers. She thought about the girl in the photograph, grinning behind a rifle, almost as big as she was. who had no idea yet what the world was going to ask of her, but who had a father beside her with a spotting scope, pointing at distances, teaching her to read what was really there when she was finally done. When she had sat with it long enough, she closed the journal, put the photograph back in her breast pocket, close to where her heart was, where it had lived for 11 months, sat up straight, breathed, and in that small barracks room, at the end of the longest 6 weeks of her life, Sergeant First Class Claire Reeves made one more decision. Not a promise. She was done with promises. She had kept all of them, a decision that what had happened in that canyon was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something for every soldier who came after her, for every woman who would stand on a grinder and have a room decide what she was before she opened her mouth, for every Callum Haynes who needed someone to explain the difference between controlling a breath and fighting one, for every person who had been told that physics said so, that the distance was too great, the conditions too complex, the target too small, and had almost believed it. She thought about what her father had said once, on a Colorado hillside when she was 12 and frustrated that a shot she'd been practicing for weeks still wasn't consistent. He had put his hand on her shoulder. Great shooters hit targets, he'd said, but that's not what this is really about. She had looked at him. What's it about? He had looked at the mountains. Great warriors, he said, change what people believe is possible. She had been 12 years old and hadn't fully understood it. She understood it now. The canyon still stands in Nevada. Ghost Target 7 still hangs at 1,400 meters between two walls of rock, the mountains built over millions of years. The thermal cycle still rotates every 11 seconds, patient, indifferent. To the people who come to the rim and watch or don't watch, understand or don't understand, and in the steel of that target, from the morning of one cold Nevada day in 2025, there is a different kind of history. The kind that rings out across a valley. The kind you can still hear if you're listening. The kind a father taught his daughter to hear on a hillside in Colorado, long before the world had any idea what she was becoming.